In 1937, a young truck driver named McLean sat in the cab of his rig at a pier in Hoboken, New Jersey, watching dock workers unload cotton bales from his trailer, one bale at a time, by hand, onto a ship. He waited the entire day. Sitting there, he had a thought that wouldn't fully arrive for another 19 years. Why couldn't they just lift his whole trailer off the truck and put it on the ship? That thought eventually became the most important invention of the 20th century. Almost nobody noticed. To understand why the shipping container mattered, you have to understand what shipping was before it. A typical ocean-going cargo ship in the 1950s carried about 200,000 separate pieces of freight, crates of machine parts, bags of coffee, barrels of chemicals, drums of palm oil, bales of cotton, hemp, wool, boxes of canned food. Each piece arrived at the dock on a different truck or a different rail car. Each one had to be moved into a warehouse, then out of the warehouse, then carried across the dock, then lifted by a winch into the ship's hold, then stacked by hand by men wedged into the cargo space. A common shipment was bananas. Unloading bananas required a longshoreman to walk down a gangplank with an 80-pound stem of unripe fruit on his shoulder. Coffee meant carrying 60-kilo bags, 15 to a wooden pallet, then unpacking the pallet by hand at the destination. This was not a system. It was a rolling labor disaster. Loading a single ship took 6 days. The voyage itself took 10. So nearly half of every ship's working life was spent docked, surrounded by hundreds of men, moving boxes one at a time. The cost of all this labor was the dominant cost of shipping. In 1956, hand-loading break bulk cargo cost $5.86 per ton. Most of what you paid to ship something across an ocean wasn't paying for the ocean. It was paying for the dock. And that meant the world had a particular shape. Factories had to be near customers because moving goods was so expensive that distance ate the margins. New York City made clothes, London made furniture, Detroit made cars, and shipped them to Cleveland, not Shanghai. Whole cities existed because they were near a port, and whole industries existed because they were near a city. That was the world McLean was about to flatten. McLean was not a maritime engineer. He was not a logistics theorist. He was a North Carolina truck driver who graduated high school in 1931 in the middle of the Depression and bought a used truck for $120 because his family couldn't afford to send him to college. He spent the next 20 years getting rich by being relentlessly cheap. He invented small things. He crenellated the sides of his trailers to reduce wind drag. He fought with regulators over freight rates. By 1954, McLean Trucking was the 5th largest fleet in the United States, with 617 trucks running up and down the East Coast. It was running up and down the East Coast that nearly killed him. In the early 1950s, American highways were turning into parking lots. The interstate system didn't exist yet. McLean's drivers were burning hours, fuel, and money, sitting in traffic jams between New Jersey and the Carolinas. So he had a different idea. What if his trucks didn't drive the long-distance leg at all? What if they drove to a port, dropped a trailer onto a ship, and the ship made the run up the coast, while the truck went back for another load? The trouble was, U.S. regulations didn't let a trucking company own a shipping line. So in 1955, McLean did something that, on its face, looked insane. He sold McLean Trucking, the company he had built from one truck over 20 years, and used the proceeds, plus a $22 million bank loan, to buy a shipping company instead. Then he bought 2 surplus World War II oil tankers, parked them in a shipyard, and started cutting them apart. The original idea, putting whole truck trailers on ships, turned out to be inefficient. The wheels and chassis wasted space. So McLean and a mechanical engineer named Keith Tantlinger redesigned the concept. They built a steel box 8 feet wide, 8 feet tall, 35 feet long. The box separated from the truck. The wheels stayed on land. The box had reinforced corner castings, small steel fittings, one at each corner, that let a crane lock onto it consistently, lift it, and stack it. Tantlinger's contribution wasn't really the box. It was the corner casting. That was the piece that turned a metal crate into infrastructure. On April 26, 1956, one of McLean's converted tankers, renamed the Ideal X, sat at Port Newark with 58 of these aluminum boxes stacked on a wooden deck above the oil tanks. 100 dignitaries were invited to watch. As the ship pulled away, a reporter turned to Freddie Fields, a senior official of the International Longshoremen's Association, and asked what he thought of it. Fields said, "I'd like to sink that son of a gun." 5 days later, the Ideal X arrived in Houston. McLean's cost analysts ran the numbers. Hand-loading a ton of cargo onto a comparable ship cost $5.86. Loading the Ideal X by container cost 16 cents. That is not a typo. The shipping container reduced the cost of loading a ship by a factor of 36. Here is the part of the story that gets skipped. The container did not just win on the merits. It won despite a decade of organized resistance. The longshoremen's unions understood correctly that this metal box was going to destroy their jobs. The Port of New York and New Jersey employed roughly 50,000 longshoremen in the early 1960s. Today, it employs about 4,500. The unions fought it. They struck. They sabotaged. They bargained for severance, retraining, automation taxes, anything that would slow the bleed. Some of those fights are still going on. The East Coast port strike of 2024 was, at its core, the same fight, 68 years later. The ship operators fought it because converting their fleets was expensive. The port authorities fought it because container terminals required deep berths, gantry cranes, and acres of paved land that most old urban ports didn't have. But the deepest problem was that McLean's containers only fit McLean's ships. A box loaded in Newark could be unloaded in Houston, but a box loaded in Newark could not be loaded onto a Sealand competitor's vessel because the corner castings were proprietary. McLean held the patents. He could have charged a licensing fee on every container in the world for the next 20 years. Instead, in a move that was either generous or coldly strategic, depending on how you read him, he licensed the design royalty-free to the International Organization for Standardization. In 1961, the ISO published the standard: 20 feet or 40 feet long, 8 feet wide, 8 feet tall, with corner castings in the same place every time, machined to a 1/4 inch tolerance. That is the real invention. not the box. The agreement that every box in the world would be the same box. The container went global because of a war. By the mid-1960s, the U.S. military was drowning in its own logistics in Vietnam. Cargo arrived at the port of Saigon faster than it could be unloaded. Ammunition, food, vehicles, and medicine sat for weeks on ships waiting to be hand unloaded into a country that did not have the dock workers to unload them. McLean, now running a company called Sea-Land Service, proposed something audacious. Let his containers handle the entire military supply chain into the new American base at Cam Ranh Bay. Preloaded in the United States, sealed, shipped, unloaded by gantry crane in hours instead of days. It worked. The Pentagon was stunned. The military supply chain that had nearly broken started running. And then McLean did something that, in retrospect, may have been the single most consequential business decision of the 20th century. The empty containers, after dropping off military cargo in Vietnam, were sailing back to the United States empty. So McLean started routing them through Japan on the return trip, where Japanese manufacturers loaded them with electronics, cameras, and consumer goods bound for the American market. That is the moment the modern global economy began. Not a treaty, not a tariff cut, not a political summit. A truck driver from Maxton, North Carolina, deciding not to send his ships home empty. Today, roughly 80% of all internationally traded goods by volume move by sea. Almost all of it moves in containers descended directly from the design McLean and Prelinger drew up in 1956. In 2024, the port of Shanghai became the first port in human history to handle more than 50 million containers in a single year. It ended the year at 51.5 million. The largest container ship currently afloat, the MSC Irina, is just under 400 meters long, almost the length of 4 football fields, and carries 24,346 containers stacked 26 high. If you lined up the containers from a single voyage, end to end, they would stretch over 90 miles. And the cost of getting a t-shirt or a smartphone or a refrigerator from a factory in Asia to a port in California is now so low that for most products, ocean freight is no longer a meaningful line item. The world flattened. Manufacturing migrated to wherever labor was cheapest because the distance no longer mattered. Cities like Shenzhen, which in 1980 was a fishing village of about 30,000 people, became megacities of 17 million on the back of a port that handles 30 million containers a year. This did not happen because of a politician. It happened because of a steel box. Malcolm McLean died in 2001 at his home in New York City of heart failure at the age of 87. The morning of his funeral, container ships in ports all over the world sounded their horns at the same time. Most of the people working at those ports had no idea who he was. That is the fate of the most important invention of the 20th century. It is everywhere. It moves almost everything you own. And the man who built it died, more or less, anonymous, because the thing he built was so successful that it became invisible. He never patented the corner casting for himself. He never tried to. He understood, before almost anyone, that the value wasn't in owning the box. The value was in everyone, everywhere, agreeing to use the same one.